Welcome to In the Loop, a podcast by Civic Duty Rice. My name is Max Martucci. I'm a freshman from SID.
And I'm Meredith McCain. I'm a sophomore at Duncan.
Today we're going to be talking about domestic violence as a cultural presence and the role it's played in recent White House scandals, a topic that we've thought was fitting to record on Valentine's Day.
Oh, no. You didn't have to do that.
Oh, darn it. Hi, welcome to In the Loop. My name is Max Martucci. I'm a freshman from SID.
And I'm Meredith McCain, a sophomore from Duncan.
Today we're going to be talking about domestic violence as a cultural presence and the role it's played in recent White House scandals.
So before we begin, we'd like to provide y'all with some updates on global events that are happening here in the country, all around the world, things that you might have heard about but are just interesting to bring to your attention. So first of all, the Winter Olympics kicked off in Pyeongchang over the weekend, and it was a very interesting situation in terms of North Korea's participating in the games under a unified flag with South Korea, and Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, was actually at the games seated very close to Mike Pence during the opening ceremonies.
So that's obviously a recipe for comedy of the darkest kind. But there's been a little bit of a focus on how the U.S. media has treated Kim Jong-un's sister, whose name is Kim Yo-jong, by the way. And a lot of people have accused the media of sort of fawning over her. NBC did a favorable cover of her the other day. But we're not going to go too into depth with that. It's just a little bit of an interesting tidbit that we bring to your guys' attention. Another thing that we'd like to update you guys on is the goings on with Omarosa Manigault, who worked at Trump's White House for a while. I believe, I might be wrong, but I believe she was the only African American woman employed by the White House.
Wow.
During the Trump administration, and she was fired a few weeks back, and she recently went on TV and basically trashed Donald Trump. Talked about I wouldn't vote for him again. Like, I disliked working for him. Another interesting little event. And finally, something I came across the other day. I thought this was an interesting little happening. ICE's one of their directors in Seattle, Washington, actually got arrested for stealing immigrant IDs and using them to defraud credit card companies. So again, we're not going to delve into the intricacies of that, but I thought it was interesting. So. Meredith, we're going to be talking about domestic violence today. How about you provide us with a little bit of background on sort of the domestic violence scandal that's rocked the White House recently? Rocked, of course, maybe not being the appropriate word.
More like, I don't know.
Moderately shuddered.
Yeah.
But how about you give us a little bit of information on recent events?
So last week, it came to light that White House aide, one of the top aides actually, Rob Porter, has been accused of domestic violence and abuse by two of his ex-wives, along with at least one former girlfriend. And the White House supposedly knew about these domestic abuse allegations for quite some time. The FBI had been conducting his background check since January of 2017. They delivered a report to the White House in March that said there were some problems in Porter's history. And then they delivered yet another report in July that, while we still don't know what all was contained in that report, most likely had some of the details about the abuse allegations in it. Yet the White House still gave Rob Porter partial security clearance. He continued to work in his position, and it wasn't until last week when these allegations came out that he finally resigned.
Yeah, so obviously the timeline of the allegations, and when the White House knew about them in reference with when they fired Rob Porter is getting to be a little bit muddled. There's conflicting accounts from the New York Times and the Washington Post, but it's overwhelmingly likely that the White House knew about the allegations before they came to light in the public eye. Additionally, we don't want to forget another domestic violence scandal that's happened recently with the White House involves a speechwriter named David Sorensen, who resigned last week, and he was accused of domestic violence by former partners and wives. There were photos of him that emerged on the internet, or not photos of him, photos of his ex-wife on the internet, where she had a black eye. She claims that he threw him into the wall, that he threw her into the wall, that he put out cigarettes on the palms of her hands, et cetera, et cetera. And that's kind of been overshadowed by the whole Porter scandal because it doesn't involve the White House bureaucracy as much. But we don't want to forget about that either. Another thing that is important to mention with regards to the background and sort of the scandal itself is the way that the White House has handled it since the allegations emerged. So they've been in full on denial mode as we've come to expect, and as some of you may have heard, Trump himself sent out a tweet the other day, sort of decrying the lack of due process, and it was sort of an attack on the hashtag Me Too movement as a whole, without being that in name. Other officials have made similar remarks. Senator Orrin Hatch, who's the longest serving senator in the United States,
from Utah,
correct, said, and I quote, "The country needs more honest, principled people like Rob Porter, which is why I hope that this cynical campaign to discredit his character ultimately fails." So there's a lot to unpack here, but we figured that we should start out. We're going to be talking about such a broad topic. We want to define what we're going to be discussing. So, Meredith, how would you define domestic abuse or domestic violence, in addition to sexual harassment and assault, kind of how the two things are interrelated?
So I don't want to give my own personal definition because I think this can very much vary from person to person, but the Department of Justice defines domestic violence as a pattern of abusive behavior in a relationship that's used by one partner to gain power, control over the other partner, and then wield it to their benefit. So this could include physical violence, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological violence, or threats that would be used to coerce that person into doing certain things or acting a certain way. And this, it can be interrelated with sexual assault as well, but they are somewhat two distinct things, because sexual assault is any type of sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the recipient. So we see how these things both are tied in with notions of abuse, of power dynamics that are used to really hurt the victim in these situations. Right.
Like Meredith said, we wanted to address these as a whole, even though the episode is nominally about domestic violence. We wanted to make the point that our cultural attitudes towards sexual assault, sexual harassment, and domestic abuse, domestic violence, they're very similar, and they sort of stem from similar cultural perceptions and stereotypes, et cetera, et cetera. The final point that I want to make before we really delve into the concept is, I think that throughout this episode, we're probably going to fall into the trap of framing domestic assault as an explicitly male on female thing, when really it's not. Although the vast majority of violent domestic assaults and sexual domestic assaults are committed by men upon their spousal partners, there are of course instances where women have abused their male partners. We're not even really going to delve into LGBT relationships, because we didn't consider ourselves well enough sort of. We're not even going to delve into the topic of domestic abuse in LGBTQIA relationships, because neither of us felt that we were well enough acquainted with the topic to really present an informative podcast on it.
And that's probably enough for an entire other podcast.
Yeah, one for which we'd like to bring in an interviewee, somebody who hopefully knows more about the issue from studies or personal experience than we do. So one thing that we want to talk about is why is domestic abuse such a cultural problem? What motivates people to abuse their spouses? And in this instance, frankly, we're going to be specifically talking about what motivates men to beat their girlfriends or wives. So according to the domestic violence hotline, this was a little bit of cursory research that I did. Domestic abuse is sort of a way of gaining and maintaining control over a partner. And if you think about it, beyond the surface level, nobody beats their partner because they get a kick out of, violence itself, right? They're always trying to do it to get the upper hand on the person. They're trying to do it to make themselves feel a certain way. And Meredith, what do you think? How does this relate to the way that our culture sort of views men and how they should behave?
Well, I think we see especially, well, we can't really speak for cultures outside of American culture, but we see hypermasculinity as a very overvalued concept and notion. So I feel like it's praised in media, this like notion of the all-dominating alpha male who just has power over his girlfriend, his partner, whoever. So I feel that domestic abuse, domestic violence is really the embodiment of that unhealthy culture and a way for men to assert their masculinity when they feel that it's lacking in a relationship or when they feel that they need to gain a stronger foothold or control over their partner.
Right. And, this sort of ties into how our culture in particular discourages men from expressing their emotions, period. And when they do express their emotions, they're discouraged they're discouraged from doing it through words or any other mode of expression, and they're encouraged to do it through action. So if I'm a man in this hypothetical scenario and I'm feeling emasculated, right, our culture dictates that I shouldn't talk to my spouse or my significant other about it, right? I should take action to ensure that I don't feel emasculated anymore, to quote unquote remedy the situation, right? And that's what's so disturbing about the whole thing, is that none of these reasons are particularly foreign to anybody. I mean, certainly. I'd say only a small minority of men in the American population have actually committed domestic assault, but these feelings.
Do we know that for sure?
You know what? Actually, you make a very good point. Yeah, especially with some of the allegations that are coming to light. But like none of these notions, none of these feelings are I think that foreign to anybody, and it's kind of scary.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what about this point? So let's talk about how Donald Trump in particular has treated women who have accused their partners of sexual assault, and like how is that kind of differed from instance to instance?
I think this most recent instance with Rob Porter is really reminiscent of his defense of Roy Moore, when there were accusers stepping forward saying that Roy Moore had molested them, sexually assaulted them when they were minors even, and Trump just came in and tried to discredit all these women. Came to Roy Moore's defense when he was running for Senate in Alabama, and it really he just glazes over any accusation, and it's this immediate jump to, well, he's being denied due process. You can't just assume guilt, which on one hand is true, but on the other hand, if you have well-supported accusations, that's very good reasoning to try to listen and hear those women out.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting because I think it sort of demonstrates the way that Trump thinks about women as a whole. Because whenever the election was still happening, there was there was a period where right after the Access Hollywood tape came out, and if any of you guys recall that. The second presidential debate, one of the big sort of flashpoint issues was Bill Clinton's treatment of women in the late 1990s, and whenever that was brought up, of course, Trump believed supposed victims like Juanita Broaddrick and others, with no hesitation whatsoever, right? Because he viewed Bill Clinton as a political opponent. In fact, interestingly enough, back when he and Bill Clinton were openly friendly with one another, he had discredited those very same victims. So I think it's sort of instrumental to how Trump views women, because he views them as an extension of their male partners, right? So if he sees their male partners as being of some quality, right, then there's no way that same guy could have possibly committed assault. If he sees them as being kind of a scummy character, right, you believe the woman. And while I think that we'd like to tell ourselves that, we're better than that, not many of us have that same sort of hypocritical, flip-flop mentality. I'd encourage you guys, and I gender the term guys heavily.
You just say y'all.
Y'all.
You're from Oklahoma. Say y'all.
Right. Thank you. I encourage you guys to sort of examine your own perceptions and evaluate whether that's really true.
And also, I think bringing Bill Clinton into this shows how this is not a partisan issue. This is not just Republican men who mistreat their women. they do not possess their women, but
Yeah.
they may see it as that.
Your correction is appreciated.
So, yes, Bill Clinton, prominent Democrat, he did some very sketchy things to women, with women, possibly without their consent.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this shows it transcends party boundaries and ideological spectrum, because men all over the spectrum can be guilty of offenses such as this.
Yeah, and again, this is how it sort of ties back into the issue of sexual assault. I think a lot of people think of domestic violence and sexual assault as two very different things, right? A lot of people, if they see a woman, walking to the grocery store, exiting her house with a black guy, they immediately think, oh, the husband's a wife beater, and they abhor the guy, right? But many types of sexual assault are a lot less visible than that. They're a lot less obvious, and yet the perceptions surrounding them are absolutely the same. If I think a husband's a great guy, I might be less inclined to think that to believe his wife if she says that he beats her, right?
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, if the same basic principles apply to domestic violence and sexual assault, which is why it's fallacious to think of them as two entirely separate entities, right?
Yeah.
So I guess we kind of just talked about this, but of course it's intrinsically connected to the hashtag #MeToo movement. Do you think that we're reaching a sort of watershed moment for awareness of domestic violence and speaking truth to power, both political and otherwise, when it comes to sexual assault or domestic violence? Or do you think this is just sort of a peak or a trough?
I think it's just a peak. That sounds cynical, but as long as cultural attitudes aren't shifting, then this is just an echo chamber. The hashtag #MeToo movement, while enlightening some people on the outside of it and causing some men to confront their biases and to possibly change the way they see gendered relations, it's very much amongst people who already saw domestic violence and sexual assault as bad things. So the fact that all these men are being accused of it, well, yes, it's a good thing that we're ousting them, but it seems kind of like a purge, and then there'll be a reaccumulation of instances such as this, which will then be later on revealed once again in a huge media scandal. So I know that's pretty cynical viewpoint of it, but I don't know how effective it will be in the long run at actually shifting our societal outlook on instances such as this.
Especially because, when you look at the results that the Me Too movement has achieved, which I totally agree, they're non-negligible. There have been some really bad guys who have lost their jobs or been kicked out of industries, but when you actually look at the sort of individual instance by instance results, it's apparent that our actual standards, how we view sexual assault versus domestic violence, haven't really changed, right? Mm-hmm. Like a guy like Harvey Weinstein, as soon as those allegations came to light, everybody knows that what he did was wrong, right? Everybody agrees. Everybody listened to the woman on that issue, and we had, it was good times all around for at least everybody, but Harvey Weinstein and the women he abused. But it takes something like the Aziz Ansari allegations, right?
Yeah, very muddy waters there. Very
muddy waters, and I feel like the allegations, while maybe not being as damaging, were at least as severe. It demonstrates kind of how our culture refuses to adjust its conceptualizations of domestic violence or sexual assault whenever it makes us uncomfortable,
So as we had mentioned earlier, we just touched on the subject of due process in the course of these scandals and accusations of domestic violence and sexual assault. But we want to kind of dig deeper into that and the notion of due process. What due process rights should be socially allocated to the accused in these situations? Since in many situations, the statute of limitations to throw them in prison has already run out, or to put them even in front of a judge and a jury. But there are many people who say it's just inherently unfair that because these men have been accused that they should lose their job. So I know Max has a lot of opinions on this.
Yeah, so obviously, we can't really talk about a legal due process here. Number one, because it's not really up for debate. Like, if somebody is accused of a crime, that's how it works. Like, they have to be given legal due process before they go to jail. Like, they can't just instantly, be sent to a back alley firing squad, like without any thorough investigation whatsoever. However, we need to examine the difference between social due process and legal due process. And if you guys aren't familiar with this, I'll sort of provide a little bit of an example. So if I think that my employee has been abusing his wife, say that I'm the manager of a restaurant, and I think that my head server has been abusing his wife, then there's nothing at all that prevents me from firing him if I think that, right? I can do it. I can do it for whatever reason I want. I have all freedom to do that, right? I can't.
Only if it appears like non-discriminatory, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Only if it appears non-discriminatory. So when people talk about due process with reference to sexual assault, they're not talking about legal due process. They're talking about social due process. Oh, you can't just fire this guy because of allegations that were made, blah, 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 blah. If you frequent certain online circles, or if you hang around certain people, you know that it's a pretty common argument, and you're familiar with the idolization of due process as a concept. And while I think that legal due process is a perfectly good thing, we should look at like social due process critically and really start to analyze it. Meredith, considering the society that we live in and considering the standards that society holds, do you think that social due process holds as much value as many make it out to?
I think it's an important concept, but I think it's very overrated and it's talked about way too much, especially among people who defend the accused. I think if there are a lot of accusations coming out that seem to be well corroborated, then why should we not think that person is guilty of it? Why should they not lose their job? Why should we continue to maintain their innocence when you have 3, 4, 5 women saying, this man sexually assaulted me, I have this evidence, and there's this many other victims? I think there's some value in due process socially, but at the same time, just as a woman, as someone who knows quite a few people who have been sexually assaulted, victims of domestic abuse, it's really hard for me to continue to have an unbiased view of an accused person in a social context.
Exactly. Yeah. And especially when you consider, circumstances that we live in, when you take the big picture into consideration, it becomes more and more apparent that it's impossible to look at issues like domestic violence critically when our culture overwhelmingly supports the man accused and overwhelmingly tries to devalue the experiences of the victim. Like, all you got to do is take a cursory glance at recent political events, or if you want to hear some statistics, actually, this isn't exactly what we're talking about, but I'm looking at RAINN.org, which is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. For every 310 rapes that are reported to the police, 57 of them lead to arrest, which isn't exactly a great ratio. 11 get referred to prosecutors. 7 lead to a felony conviction, and only 6 out of 310 rapists who are reported to the police will ever be incarcerated. So if you need evidence of societal bias against victims and sort of for the accused, you need look no further than that. And again, Meredith and I both have friends who have suffered through sexual trauma or who have been sexually abused. And if you know somebody like that, you know how difficult it is to come forth, period. You know the stigma that surrounds it. You know how inherently traumatic it is just to discuss these things. When you place due process on a pedestal and enforce it so ridiculously rigidly, you make that process even harder, and you, ironically enough, make it harder to hold abusers accountable. Would you agree? Yeah.
But actually, so I think I didn't introduce the other viewpoint well enough earlier, and I think I need to do that and go back and address it. So I guess devil's advocate in our situation here, or the popular viewpoint in some other circles, is that when these men are accused of sexual assault, sexual violence, it seems that in some instances, like college campuses, the pendulum has possibly swung in the other direction too far. I say that in air quotes. And this is because there might be this huge uprising by students in support of the victim and against the accused, and then that could maybe ruin the accused student career, their prospects of a job in the future. So yeah, I remember something happened at my high school, and the details of the situation were very fuzzy. So no one really knows what happened, but that guy ended up losing his scholarship to college. I think he might have gone to jail for a couple years. Mm-hmm. It really messed up his prospects in life, but he's from a wealthy family, so I'm sure he'll get by just fine.
He'll survive.
Yeah, he'll survive.
He'll be handed down an oil barony or something like that.
Yeah. So not to digress too much, but that is the other viewpoint here, and that is what people who come to the defense of the accused, that's what they're seeing here. They think the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction in terms of rights of the accused.
Right. And, as we've addressed, that viewpoint on paper sounds valid, but when you look at, societal biases and other things which have been determined to exist, it just becomes clear that due process is essentially an argument for making the accused less accountable and making it harder for victims to come forth. Another final statistic that I want to throw out before we move on to sort of how this relates to stuff on college campuses is, people who emphasize due process, their main argument is what if, what if the accused didn't actually commit the crime that he, she, or they have been, accused of committing. Again, according to Rain, only 2%, that's not 20 or 200, that's 2. Only 2% of rape accusations. 200. Yeah, I know. I was trying to make a point. Only 2% of rape accusations are false. So I would keep that in mind whenever we're debating what if, because 2% is a rather negligible probability in my opinion. So you might be asking yourself, how does this relate to Rice life or our daily life in general? And I think sort of a handy segue into this is if you're familiar with Betsy DeVos, who's the Trump administration's head of the Department of Education, you'll know that she supports many of his initiatives, and you might agree or disagree with some of her policies. But a few months ago, there was a part of Title IX, a specification of Title IX that the Obama administration included in a letter to college campuses at large, which basically encouraged them to listen to victims and I guess. So this brings us to a pretty handy segue into Rice campus life and college campus life in general. If you're familiar with a woman named Betsy DeVos, she is the Trump administration's head of the Department of Education. She's brought some controversial policies to the drawing board, and some of them have been implemented. One of the big decisions by this administration's Department of Education that's attracted a lot of controversy and brought a lot of ire was its rescindment, or I guess the correct word is rescission, of an Obama-era letter to 7,000 public universities specifying Title IX requirements. And what that Obama-era letter did was it encouraged these universities to accept the so-called lowest form of proof, aka a preponderance of evidence, as evidence or proof that sexual assault was committed on campus. And there were a lot of people who saw this as an essential step towards protecting victims of sexual assault, among other things. And the DeVos Department of Education, of course, recently rescinded this. An interesting tidbit that I found out a few months ago was right before rescinding that letter and nixing those guidelines, Betsy DeVos actually met with a group of men's rights activists. These are people who claim to advocate on behalf of victims and are sort of the prototypical due process advocates. And we thought that was a little interesting, of course, given our opinions on social due process, among other things. But speaking of sexual assault on college campuses, how does Rice in particular, or college life in particular, compare to America at large with respect to sexual assault or domestic violence? see those Hi, I'm Gavin McInnes. Welcome to Right Wing News, where we discuss cultural Marxism and the left's war on traditional marriage.
Oh my gosh. At the So sexual assault and domestic violence are issues that do affect us here on campus and as college students. And actually back in 2015, or I believe maybe spring of 2016, Rice released the results of the survey on unwanted sexual experiences, and found that 19%, so nearly 1/5 of female students and 5% of male students who took the survey reported having experienced some form of unwanted sexual contact, ranging from unwelcome kissing or touching to sexual assault and rape. So even though many people thought before this survey came out that sexual assault, domestic violence, and sexual abuse weren't issues that affected us as students, they very much are. And nationally, women between ages of 18 and 24 are most commonly abused by an intimate partner. And 1 in 5 students have suffered domestic assault at the hands of a current partner, according to a study done by University of Michigan in 2007.
So again, just to rehash on that most recent statistic, that's 1 in 5 students have suffered domestic assault at the hands of a current partner, as in somebody who they are currently in a relationship with, which I found to be profoundly shocking. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting aspects, or I don't know if interesting is the right word, it's maybe more depressing, but one of the interesting aspects of one of the statistics Meredith cited was the results of that survey that the Rice Student Association released in 2016. I think that it goes to show how, especially as somebody who's not intrinsically intimate with the issue, who doesn't have to worry about being sexually assaulted. I'm a tall guy. I'm not exactly the target of this type of thing, and a lot of times it's easy to just go through your life without really realizing that stuff like this happens, because these mentalities are so ingrained into us, and the problem of sexual assault and domestic violence is so insidious and often not talked about enough that it's hard to treat because it's never diagnosed. Would you agree?
Yes, I definitely agree. I think that. Wait, can you pause for a second? I'm so sorry.
And I think one of the reasons why we seem to have such a cultural block against talking about domestic assault and sexual violence is that there's a shame that accompanies being abused, not just the one that people might consider whenever they think about the issue, but that of being made to feel powerless or weak. But there's also this we place a high value on the concept of relationships as a whole, and this is particularly evident around times of year like this one, where people are celebrating just being in a relationship on Valentine's Day. People are happy just to be with somebody else. And when you're in an abusive relationship, when you're being abused, I feel like there's a shame that accompanies that, because you might feel like you've taken something that was supposed to be good and emotionally nourishing for the both of you, and you've somehow been deficient in your role as a romantic partner. There are victims of abuse who have a tendency to blame themselves in these types of situations. So maybe that's the reason why victims especially feel uncomfortable bringing this stuff up, is because there's an implied deficiency that goes along with being a victim of domestic assault. Would you agree?
Yes. So I'm going to try to unpack everything you just said there. So the first point you made, in terms of it's possible for people to go through their entire lives without even knowing that sexual assault, domestic violence are a thing. That's definitely, like you said, like a prevalent, or definitely a much more prevalent viewpoint among men, because these were things that I was exposed to from a pretty young age, just from having friends that were either in abusive relationships, victims of sexual assault or rape. And it is really a wake-up call as like a young high school-aged girl to hear about your closest friends going through things such as this. And then the reverse of that is like for guys to not really be talking about this, since there's more stigma about discussing your emotions, among guys, and maybe some guys don't recognize what they did was a transgression against a woman or a female partner. It's this weird dynamic where like girls know about it from a very young age and know about it and talk about it, or maybe don't talk about it for their entire lives, whereas guys can go through their entire lives without really knowing it's an issue, unless it's brought to their attention or it's a forced conversation. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but one that we have to have. And so what you're saying about Valentine's Day is also another very valid point, and I think it does make the whole culture around relationships much more complicated, because if we're in a relationship and we're experiencing violence in that relationship, then traditions such as Valentine's Day, such as anniversaries and all that goes along with it, really makes us want to hide whatever negatives we're facing in that. And it goes along with just us wanting to put our best face forward. And I think with like a culture like at Rice too, where people always want to put their best face forward, always want to look like they're succeeding, achieving.
Happy in whatever they're doing.
Yes, happy. We're the happiest students, second happiest students in the country.
Yeah.
There's probably even more of a stigma with bringing that to the attention of friends and peers. You don't want to go up to someone and be like, yeah, so it's Valentine's Day, but guess what? Like, I've been abused by my boyfriend for the past few months. That's not something that people really just come out and say. And that actually brings me to the point of there was an op-ed published in the Thresher this week.
I saw that. I saw that. Oh, my God, it was awful.
Yes. It was actually published today about a girl who was sexually assaulted 2 weeks ago, and she wrote this long opinion piece just talking about the lack of support she received, even from people who knew it had happened to her. All they could say was, "Are you okay?" And no one offered her support, told her, "Wow, this is very wrong that this happened to you. We're going to get you the help that you need."
Yeah.
And it's just very frustrating that this girl actually dared to talk about this very uncomfortable event with friends and with a coworker of hers and did not receive the support that she needed.
And it's interlinked because we're so because we never like to talk about this openly as a society. Whenever somebody does bring forth the issue and needs serious assistance, most of us are ill-equipped to handle that conversation. I'm sure the people who work at the Women's Resource Center are quite adept at their jobs, but they aren't the first people that you're going to go to whenever you've experienced something like this. You're going to go to your friends or to your parents or to your siblings. So it's not great that people don't know how to handle this type of thing. Speaking from personal experience, my kind of awakening when it comes to finding out about just how much of an epidemic sexual assault is. I was my senior year was the first time when I really started to make friends with girls in my school, and that was the first time that I've ever been actually like close to somebody who's gone through that type of thing. And until you've had a conversation with somebody where they've addressed like the trauma that they went through and the specifics of the entire situation, you can't possibly understand why certain things are as damaging as they are. You can understand how it makes the person feel. So especially as a guy, guys are less inclined to, be friends with people who have experienced sexual assault by virtue of mostly hanging out with other guys. You're not going to know whether, you're interacting with women in a damaging way. You're not going to know whether something you've done is traumatic, which isn't to excuse that sort of activity, but it's a problem that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. So I guess this brings us to our call to action, which it can make us feel very powerless talking about these deep topics without there seeming to be an instant solution to any of it. But there are some resources available. For example, a lot of the statistics that I was citing were from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which is an organization that you should check out if you or anyone you know has been a victim of domestic violence. They offer resources and can provide you with some more guidance about how to move forward if you've been victimized. Also, the Houston Area Women's Center is a great resource for people here on campus and in the Houston area to help women who have been victims of domestic violence and sexual assault and abuse. And in addition, we have on-campus resources such as Max said, the Rice Women's Resource Center, which may not be your go-to place, but they do offer support and resources such as condoms and tampons and other items But it is students, so if you feel more comfortable talking to a peer rather than to an adult about what you've been through, then that might be the place for you to go.
So before I sort of provide my piece on, the call to action and ways that you can get involved and help, improve our culture surrounding sexual assault, I want to make apparent one last time that the biggest problem that I think we as a culture face with regards to this issue is the way that we think of sexual assault, the way that we define it. Because guys like Harvey Weinstein or Weinstein, however you pronounce his name, are always going to receive universal condemnation because it's a gimme, right? Like everybody knows that what Weinstein did was horrible. Nobody's going to be defending him. When you start to get into the gray areas is when we need to listen to survivors. We need to listen to women. If somebody says that something which happened to them was traumatic, I think that the burden of proof should be on the accused to prove that it wasn't. So I guess I would end with the message of believe women, try to improve your own personal definitions of sexual assault if need be, and that's the biggest step that I think that the layman could take towards improving our sexual assault culture. Additionally, there are a million other places that you can go around campus or within Houston or nationally to aid in the issue. We have an office of our Title IX coordinator on campus. You can talk to them. We have a wellbeing and counseling center, which I'm sure you've all seen on posters in bathrooms, etc. Some of the organizations whose facts we cited in previous segments of the podcast, organizations like RAIN or other like national entities are always going to be of immense help to survivors or anything. So if you don't have time to volunteer, you can donate. That's a great way of getting involved. Other than that, I think that that's a pretty comprehensive catalog of ways you can help survivors and ways you can sort of be productive in this field. So I think we're about ready to wrap this up.
Mm-hmm. And I. So I guess the last thing I would have to say and add to this conversation is that if you have been a victim of sexual assault or domestic violence or abuse, just know that you are not alone. There are people who want to support you, who want to help you. And even if you don't find that support right away, which I sincerely apologize, I may not know you, but that makes me just feel terrible. But even if you don't find that support right away, you will be able to find that support through some of our on-campus resources. So just reach out and don't be afraid to do so because, like I said, a lot of us have been there. We have been through this. We see what it's like, and you will come out stronger on the other side, and it's an awful thing to have to go through, but hopefully in the long run we'll be able to change the culture surrounding these phenomena so that we can hopefully improve it in the future and make a better future for all women and victims.
Yeah, and I guess, my final statement on this before we have to wrap this up, which is maybe a superfluous one, is if you're uncomfortable going to any of the listed organizations or if you don't have somebody who you feel comfortable, talking to about this particular issue, Meredith and I, although we're not obviously the best equipped people to try and handle this, we're both comfortable talking about it. I think we both consider ourselves to be pretty empathetic people. So if you ever really need somebody to talk about, you can find both of us easily on social media. You guys know our names. You guys know now what college we're at. So seriously, if you need to talk to somebody and you're not comfortable with any of the listed groups, have no qualms about coming to one of us. All right, so that wraps up today's podcast, which was one of our more lighthearted ones. We'll see you guys next week.
So these are some ways you can become more involved in this issue. Thank you for listening, and please leave comments and join the conversation online. We try to be unbiased here, but we truly can't get all the perspectives without you, our listeners. Join us next time to stay in the loop.